we are here to learn how to unearth our authentic stories and how to, share them and tell them with confidence. So my first question to you is, how does this experience of being ashamed, of being scared to tell your story manifest in real life? What was the experience for you? What were the telling signs?
I think to give context behind the book, we were talking about it with Dean. Yeah, we were talking about it with Dean before. Originally, when I pitched the book to Hachette, my publisher, the idea was to talk about how to overcome imposter syndrome for professionals and entrepreneurs and leaders. And it kind of became an integral part of the book, but we shifted it to something bigger, which was story. And when I started writing the book, the irony of it is I was trying to argue about why we should all talk a little bit more about ourselves in a business and professional setting, but I wasn't sharing my story. And I remember, I think the editor, if anybody's ever written a book or been, with editors, your editor will look at the manuscript and then put little notes on the side, things like, that's okay, but you've got to go deeper. And at one point, she basically said, but you're not talking about yourself. There's no part of your story, but you're telling the world that you should tell more about yourself, but you don't talk about yourself. And I realized that the irony behind it, but one of them is because I think for a lot of us, we've bought into this story that your professional self and your personal self should be really distinct. And they should never really cross, because if anybody knew who you really were, then you'd never get a job again. And so there's a story I talk about in the book, and it's a true story, but it's 2009, I go through a really bad breakup. I was living in Peru at the time. I quit my corporate job and I come back and I end up at my parents' house. And I struggle with that identity of having to wake up at my parents' house. And I went through a dark time. And I remember telling my mum one day, and I'm like, Mum, I think I might be depressed. And she looked at me straight up and she was like, don't tell anyone. And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, no one. No. She said, not did she say, don't tell anyone. She's like, don't even tell Dennis. Dennis is my best friend, right? And I'm like, why? She's like, because no one's ever going to hire you. So, but she's read the book, and we've joked about this since. And she came from a place of, she wanted to protect me and she was caring. But we've come a long way through the conversation of mental health. The reason why I mention this is that story stayed with me of oh my God, I can't talk about me, because if I talk about myself, then I won't be employable. I'm not going to be lovable. I'm not going to be accepted. So I kind of, dug it deep. And then fast forward to 2012, I get, does anybody know Movember? The Movember, yeah. So I joined the Movember Foundation as employee number 3 in Team Europe. And my task is to launch the foundation across Europe in some countries. And so I'm in France. And I'm launching Movember in France, and I'm giving this talk at a bar that is not at all as nice as this bar, okay? It's a super grungy bar in Paris. It stinks of stale beer on the floor. And I go through this talk and presentation, talking about Movember, why we're launching Movember, and she says, and there's a journalist in the room that raised their hand, and she says to me, why did you join Movember? Because it's a bit of a weird, hairy kind of affair. And in that moment, I think I had this kind of two roads I could travel. One of them I could have come up with this nice little cookie cutter answer of hey, this is the veneer side of why I did it. And the other one was to tell the truth, which was when I was going through this really difficult time in 2009, I came across Movember, and their website really spoke to me. Their marketing message was having fun, doing good. And so as a young man who was going through a tough time, the idea of talking about your mental health, the idea of talking about your health was really resonated with me. But up until that point, I'd never spoken about that story. Even some of my really close friends didn't know I'd gone through a tough time. So in front of this group of random strangers, including some national press, I kind of said the truth. And I was so scared. I was like, that's it, career suicide right here. No one's going to sign up to Movember. And to my biggest surprise, the floor didn't open up. No one threw tomatoes at me. Nobody said And instead, this guy came up to me at the end, and he said, it's the first time I've seen another guy talk openly about their struggle. And I wasn't quite sure about this November thing, but I'm actually going to sign up now, and I'm going to bring some friends. And over the years, I kept on telling my story linked to why I believed in November's mission, and we raised 2.8 million euros for men's health. We got 110,000 people to sign up. We won a bunch of awards. And that was kind of the premise of the book, this idea of that actually we all have a story that we can tell, whether that's to become more visible at work, whether that's to try and win more projects, whether that's to try and enroll clients as to why the strategy is more relevant. I think there's ways to tell stories, and I think personal human stories matter.
That's interesting. We are now in a room full of marketers and business leaders. And I think, I'm definitely sometimes, and, even in this situation, I'm asking myself, and I believe other people are too, it's like, what can my personal story do for my professional life? Why does it matter? Why would people care what I have to say at work about my own personal experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's a lot to unpack, and I know it's a very short snapshot tonight, so I'm going to try and make it really quick. When I was researching for the book, because the original premise question was, if we all know that talking about the work that we do matters, whether that's to try and advance our career, or whether that's to grow our businesses or to inspire our teams, why do so many of us struggle to do it? And I worked with leaders, I surveyed and interviewed entrepreneurs, and I kind of came up with these 9 blockers, like these 9 story blockers. They're in the book, you can read them. There's a chapter, I think it's called Story Blockers Personas. And it was I want to say excuses, but it sounds loaded, it's not, but it's kind of the reasons that we all have. And they kind of follow a chronological perspective. I was talking with Joe about it earlier. And the idea is kind of like the first question, but I don't need to sell this to you, because if you're in marketing, you probably know that storytelling matters. I mean, I'm just going to assume that everybody here is kind of on board with stories is kind of a big deal when it comes down to getting people to pay attention to what we have to say, sell, or share. So the big one was the story, but the second one was like, I don't see how my personal story matters. So when you're in business, whether you're in business in B2B or B2C, or people tend to want to work with you and give you projects or give you their money if they know, like, and trust you, right? So in 2012, Google did a study to understand why is it that people buy products and services more than other products and services, and they came up with this idea of the 0 moment of truth. I'm sure lots of you must be aware of it. But the idea was that there needs to be a certain number of interactions across a certain number of platforms for a certain number of time before people feel like they know, like, and trust the business. And so I think it's why we also know here why a lot of brands associate with ambassadors, because it kind of creates this relatability, this trust. And so the thing that gets you the fastest way between where you are and people to know, like, and trust you, turns out it's your story. Now, I want to make a caveat. This is not therapy. Okay? I'm saying this because there's a place for that. There's a place where you can go with a professional, talk about your deep wounds. I talk about in the book the different types of stories we can share in any context. But the idea was to say that it's really difficult for people to understand why you're passionate about the work that you do if they don't know a little bit more about the context behind you. There's a podcast called The Diary of a CEO. It's one of the biggest podcasts in Europe, and it's not a coincidence that the first question it asks every guest is, what do I need to know about you in order to understand the person that sits across me? And I think in the business context the same. Now, what happens a lot is that even if I can convince you and tell you all these different case studies around why storytelling matters, why personal story matters, what happens often is people say, oh, but my story's not that interesting. I don't have a Hollywood story. I didn't overcome massive trauma, or whatever, fill in the blank. But what you're experiencing is proximity bias. Is anybody aware with the term proximity bias? It's this concept that you're too close to something to appreciate it.
I guess the first step is really to kind of come face to face with some of these story blockers, with some of these limiting beliefs. How can we do that? Because they obviously serve a purpose. We've lived with them our whole lives. They're there to protect us from judgment, from harm. So how do we challenge those beliefs?
Okay, so first of all, we all need to realize that even though we're in 2023 and we can now tap on a phone and get food delivered and what have you, like from a biology perspective, we haven't evolved that much. So we still are hardwired like this is survival mode, right? Like all of us are hardwired for seeking three things effectively. It's kind of minimizing pain, seeking pleasure, and minimizing energy consumption. Our brains are literally hardwired to make sure that we're safe, because back in the good olden days, if you're thinking about we're all gathered around a fire, we want to make sure that we are part of a tribe and that we're part of a group of people. If we're not, we're most likely going to die, right? Like some saber-toothed tiger is jumping out of a bush and we're not making it back alive. So it's almost ingrained in our society, this concept of, and there's loads of expression, by the way. When I was going through the book, talking to different leaders around the world, it was fascinating to hear how this expression was expressed in different cultures. There's this idea the tall poppy gets chopped or the tall nail gets hammered down. It's this idea that if you kind of like step out of the norm and the mold, you're more likely to be vulnerable. So if you understand that, like you've got to understand that, wow, this amazing survival mechanism that I've come built in is trying to protect me, right? So I talk about the book about overriding your operating system. You've literally got to like hijack it, right? This idea like, okay, thank you, you're trying to help me to survive, but this isn't going to serve me on the long run. So the idea is to go, how can I start opening up a little bit more, showing myself a little bit more in an almost, I want to say, safe kind of way. Like there's a big difference between, you're going to read my book, you go from where you are now to suddenly going on stage and like opening about your story. And there are steps around that. So again, and you'll see in the book, there's different kind of formulas you can follow. But one of the things that I found is to kind of go, if there's already an interest and a curiosity behind it, then you kind of explore, okay, what is an opportunity that I've got coming up where I could perhaps talk a little bit more about why I'm really passionate about this project. So I'll give an example. I'm working with a bank at the moment with their chief sustainability officers. And the idea is around how to help them reconnect with their internal shareholders and external shareholders around why sustainability matters. So the go-to would be, do some marketing materials and promote it and talk about it. But actually, the first step I say is like, no, tell me about a moment when you were a child, when you were a kid, where you have these fond memories of being in nature or something. So they reconnect to like, what is it that they're really passionate about? And then I take it back to the topic, which is why is sustainability something really important to you? And all it is contextualizing your why. It sounds kind of woo-hoo a little bit, but it's this idea of if you can connect to what drives you, why this project matters, why you want this client to succeed, or why this project should be heard, then it gives people a reason to pay attention. And I think it just cuts through the noise, if I'm being perfectly honest. Definitely, I just went on a tantrum down the black hole. But.
No, that was perfect. And so, can you tell us a little bit about your framework? So, in the book, the big nerd that I am, I went through all of your journaling prompts, I went through all of your instructions, but I would really love for everyone to go home, today and really to be encouraged to do these exercises too. So, can you tell us a bit about the framework that you uncover in this book?
Yeah, and to set that up, let me just tell you a quick story if that's okay. So when my nephew was around 3 years old, he's 13 now, he's a proper teenager, but when he was 3 years old, my mum said, can you go and get the Lego bag? Now the Lego bag is like this bag that my brother and I as kids used to play with. One of my mum's friends did this denim bag with a little cord in it that looked like almost like Father Christmas's bag, filled with like orphan Lego pieces. And we used to put it on the floor and build stuff based on it. So we go and get it and put it on the floor, and I see my nephew kind of sorting out all these different pieces of Legos and building different structures with it. And that got me thinking, is like, that's actually like our stories. One of the reasons why we feel kind of a bit overwhelmed to start talking about ourselves a bit more in a professional context with our businesses is that we don't know which stories are relevant. We don't know which stories to pick according to which context we're in to land the impact we want. And what I realized by looking at my nephew doing this is that, actually what you need to do is you need to lay it all out. Like he needs to put all the Lego on the floor, and then he might put them like, actually this Lego goes with this one I'm not going to use it. And it's the same thing with the story. So the first part it's like a 3 S's, right? Like everybody likes acronyms or 3 things. So it's source, shape, and share. So the first part is sourcing. So sourcing, you can do this in 30 minutes, you can do this in an hour, and you can do this over like a week, right? It's as little as much as you want it to be. But the idea is that you take an inventory of your life stories from birth to date, both professional and personal. Now, what's really important to remember at this point is like, do not be attached to how is this relevant to what I do now. I don't see how me going fishing or, I don't know, tripping on a turtle when I was 5 is relevant to like me being a digital marketing expert. The idea is that you take everything out. Then what you start doing is that once you've got all these stories out, you might go, oh, that's interesting. I didn't think about this story, but this story seems somehow interesting, right? Then you apply the shaping. The shaping part of the book, it breaks it down for you, but the idea is that you do this, by the way, I don't know if anybody is storytelling geeks, but one of the issues I found with storytelling frameworks is that a lot of them are based around 7, 12, 5 steps. And when you're in a meeting, when you're in a conversation and the stakes are high, you sometimes don't have time to run like a 12-step framework in your mind as to like, what story am I going to pick? Because it's kind of like a pick and mix of a vending machine. By the end of reading the book, what I want you to have is a story bank. So like a vending machine, you're in a meeting with a client, with a peer, or whatever the situation you're in, and you can go, oh, the story I need is A12, and you pick it out and you kind of share it, right? And so the way you do that is that you can do this to multiple stories, but let's just use one story as an example. So I'm going to come up with a random story. Okay, let me tell you this random story, and then I can dissect the formula. Will that work? Yeah, okay. So when I was around 6 years old, 7 years old, I'm sitting behind my desk, and I'm looking out the window because I'm far more interested in what's happening outside with like squirrels jumping on trees than what's happening in the classroom. And my teacher says, oh, we're about to have a spelling test. And my throat gets dry, my hands becomes moist, and I start panicking, my heart's beating, because I know what's coming. I'm dyslexic, I have ADD, I can't spell to save my life, which is so ironic, why would I write a book? But I know that I'm going to do a lot of mistakes and that I'm going to be humiliated by my teacher coming up. Now, I'm going to stop there for a second. The 2 parts that I just demonstrated is what I call take me. So it's 3 parts. It's tell me, take me, teach me. So the idea is you set up the context. Very quickly, you kind of go, I'm 6 years old, I'm sitting in a classroom, and my teacher just announced a spelling test. Like, you've got the context that your brain can go, I don't need to pay too much attention to know what happens next. Then I said, I'm about to give a spelling test, and I know I'm going to be humiliated, and my palms are sweating, etc. So I'm taking into the emotion. Now, most people, when they tell stories about themselves, tend to stop there. They tend to sort of say a story. But for your story to have an impact, you need to have the third element, which is teach me. You need to land the plane. You need to land the point. Like, what is the point of the story? Because I believe that every story you share should have a point. So if I'm in a business context, okay, so if I'm talking to a company and they brought me in to talk about engagement, for example, I'll tell that story, and the third part, at the end of it, I'll say, and what I realized then, looking back at it, is that even though I couldn't spell, it didn't mean that I didn't have something I could have contributed to the classroom. And we all have that in our companies, in our teams. We all have members that we find maybe difficult, that maybe don't fit the mold. But actually, if you look at them not as difficult peers and colleagues, but as someone who can contribute something, you could win so much more, because nobody wins when people play small. So you see, I made that up, but you just take that story and you can land the third part. So just to give you the 3 things again, it's in the book I call them the 3 C's, but effectively it's tell me, take me, teach me. Give me the quick context as to what's going on in your story, what is the emotional resonance that I need to connect with, and then what's the point. And then the third part is of the 3 S's formula is the sharing. And this is what people hate, is that your story sharpens as you share it. Like, it's not going to be perfect. When you start sharing parts of your story yourself, it's just not going to be perfect. So I used to hang out with stand-up comedians in South Africa. I used to live in South Africa at one point. And I used to hang out with stand-up comedians. Has anybody heard of Trevor Noah? Yeah, so I used to hang out with Trevor back in South Africa before he was like this megastar. And I would see them stand up on stage and just do these sets over and over and over and over again. And they would make people laugh almost on demand. And what I realized is that it just got better the more they shared. Like, they would do a joke and it would bomb, and they would write down something, and then they would change it for the next set, and it would land a little bit better, and they kept doing that. And so what a lot of us struggle with is this idea that we're not going to be perfect straight away. And that can feel really scary. So my invitation for you to go is go start something that feels comfortable, which is not highly vulnerable, and know that by the time you share it 10, 20, 30 times, it'll be much better than the first time you share it.
That's amazing, and honestly, from experience, I can tell this formula is like really, really good. I think I actually I find so there's sourcing of the story, shaping of the story, which are 3 C's, and then there's sharing of the story. And I find this second bit, shaping of the story, the trickiest part. And I think perhaps that can be, somewhere where people can give up, because you really have to source the stories. And that might be easy, but then how do you pick the stories and shape them? I think what's your advice for us to stick with this formula? How?
So there's 2 things I want to talk to you about. One of them is, and I forgot, I think Dean was with you, I was talking about this, or Joe, I can't remember. When I wrote this book, I hated the entire process of writing this book. Like, I don't care who tells like, oh, writing the book was so magical and mysterious and things. They're lying, okay? 3 years it took me to write this book, and every time I'd sit down on my computer and write this book, I'd be like, you suck, this is terrible, no one's gonna care, this is shit, like all this stuff, right? So you're gonna experience all of those things, but again, I keep on going back to like, oh, it's just your defense mechanisms. It's just something in you protecting you from exposing yourself, because almost like a caring father or mother or guardian or grandparent, it just wants to make sure you're gonna be okay. So the first thing is to acknowledge that, normalize that voice inside of you. Like, I'm going to tell you, I don't care what you tell me tonight, I can guarantee for 1,000% that all of us in this room at some point have felt inadequate in a business meeting. Or we felt like we should belong in that place, or who am I to do this project, or whatever it is. So that's going to come up, yay, and it's not going to go away. And the idea to try and think that you're going to make it disappear is actually what stops people. What I say instead is, just know it's there, and like an annoying friend that keeps on poking you, it's going to be there for a little while, but you keep going. That's number 1. Number 2 is, do you remember the audience of 1? I don't even remember this concept I talk about in the book, audience of 1. Yeah. So one of the hacks I found for this is this concept I call kind of audience of 1. For all of you here, you'll be aware of the idea of avatars, or like profiles, or personas. So it's the same thing. When you shape a story, you think about who is the ideal person you'd like this story to land to. If you've ever written a newsletter or had to do digital kind of emailing for your customers, you'll know that they need to know who they're talking to. And so when I was writing my book, I had a picture of Donna. I talk about her in the book, although all the names have been changed in the book, so I forgot what name I gave her in the book now. But I was talking about Donna, and I had a picture of her on my desk. And every time I had those voices, those doubts, those struggles, I looked at Donna and I said, there are so many more Donnas out there who need to hear this or read this book so they can feel less alone in their struggle to share themselves with them. And then the third bit I would say is, this is going to sound really weird, but just be a bit gentle with yourselves, be kind with yourselves, because this stuff is hard and it will bring some stuff up, and it's okay to struggle at this kind of stuff, because most of us haven't been taught how to be more open about ourselves in a safe way. So those would be the ways that I would advise to kind of get going.
Yeah, we had a chat last week over Zoom, Mark and I actually did admit something to him, and that was that I struggled so much to start reading this book. I struggled so much because I think it's about vulnerability, to be able to face and have the courage to face some of these things. And obviously no one wants you to talk about the biggest trauma or something that's really, as Mark said, this is not therapy. But I think we have to face some of these more challenging bits of ourselves.
Yeah, and so I shouldn't say this out loud because it's supposed to be the Trojan horse of the book, but what the hell. So actually, the Trojan horse of this book is healing. So the reason why I wrote this book is that I actually don't care if you share your story or not. I know this sounds really weird. I think, no, listen, hear me out. I think you should, and I think it will 100% grow your career, business, but I actually talk about this in the book, and I say, this isn't about sharing your story, it's about who you become in the process when you own your story. So when you're playing defense all the time, which is, I'm afraid that someone's going to find out something about me, which is embarrassing, which is shameful, which is scary, which is unlovable, fill in the blank, then it's really hard to show up in a way that people can really connect with you and see you. And there's just, I'll tell you what, the biggest transformation I see clients I work with isn't so much their ability to to have a compelling engagement story when they're shared. Yeah, they can do that. It's who they become. It's like this, it's a completely different energy. Like when you own your story, warts and all, and you're no longer afraid of what people can find out about you, you just play a completely different game. It's just a much more compelling, and then from that place you can decide what are the parts you're comfortable, because there are parts of my story that I don't talk in a public setting. I talk about a little bit in the book, but I'm still going through those. And so I talk about your different types of stories in the book, just in case you're wondering. One of them is called, I think it's called your open wound stories. So the open wound stories are stories that have happened to us, or for us, depending on how you can see it. They're still raw, like you're still processing them. And although I know that social media has kind of gone a completely different way, where we kind of like almost dump ourselves online, and they can become almost a bit of a cry for help in some ways, I think there are certain spaces in which the stories are best reserved for. So for me, for example, it's with a really trusted friend, with a therapist, with a professional who can hold a space where you can really unpack these stories. Here's the catch though. These really vulnerable open room stories tend to be some of the most magnetic stories you have, and the ones that people will connect most with you. But it's not ready until it's ready. And so you've got to take a bit of time to work through them so they almost become scars, and then you can talk about them as scars versus like this really open room. So I'll give you an example. I recorded a podcast once with a guest, and I remember sharing this story. It's in the book, but this kind of vulnerable story about me as a kid. And I spoke about it, and I had what I call vulnerability hangover. So when I finished the recording, I was like, I should have said that. Like I felt a bit raw, I felt, and I felt exposed. I felt like this is going to be something that is going to come back, and actually it wasn't the case. People reached out to me and said, hey, I'm sorry that happened, and actually you're not alone. And so then you feel a little, because shame can only survive when it's not spoken to. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, you cannot heal what you don't reveal, for like one of those weird sound bites. But it's true. And so that's why I say, in a really weird way, my publisher should be like, don't say this. Like, whether you share a story doesn't really matter, but it's the idea that you face it, that you unpack it, that you own it, and that you get in the driving seat.